Good evening, everyone. The idea today is to talk a little about a subject that, within New Acropolis, we address quite frequently. We will discuss in more detail the Bhagavad Gita, which is one of the most, shall we say, classic religious books in the history of humanity. It has had influence both in the West and in the East. Naturally, it is one of the most important sacred books of the Hindu tradition. And today we'll see a brief overview of its history, a bit about how it came to be, so that we have some historical context, as well as discuss the main doctrinal points addressed in the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita is a myth that speaks about the inner war within each human being. I even made a little joke with you in the PowerPoint, showing a bit of Star Wars, which is a modern film that, in a certain way, Lucas, together with Joseph Campbell. You know that the script for this film was created in partnership with Joseph Campbell, the author of The Hero with 1,000 Faces. And they sought to recreate precisely this myth of the inner war. Everything that happens in Star Wars was an attempt to replicate, using modern imagery, this classic idea of the inner war. This is the same idea you will find in the Odyssey, the same idea you will see in the Aeneid, in the greatest classics of humanity. So, Bhagavad Gita. Gita means song, the chant. Bhagavad is the song of the Lord, the sublime song. It actually deals with the dialogue between a master and a disciple. It is quite interesting for us to understand this. India is founded upon a vast body of religious literature.
Good evening.
You have no idea. Of every kind and of every nature you can possibly imagine. In terms of epics, the two great epic poems of India are the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. The other day, we talked here about the Ramayana and shared a bit of its story. Now, in the Mahabharata, something interesting happens because it is much older than the Bhagavad Gita, and yet the Bhagavad Gita is a part of it. It's as if you said that a book has a chapter that is newer than the book itself. How is that possible? In reality, the Mahabharata, no one knows exactly when it was compiled in written form. But the Mahabharata, with the Bhagavad Gita included, only appears around the 4th century before Christ. Imagine the story of Snow White. Imagine if you took that little story that everyone knows, that everyone has learned since childhood, that everyone has heard since they were young, and focused on that moment when the huntsman leaves Snow White in the forest. And you took that moment and unfolded a dialogue between the huntsman and Snow White. And you inserted it into the story, without changing the overall context of the story. That is what happened with the Mahabharata. The story has always been the way we know it today. But when the moment arrives where there is a war between two families, the Pandavas and the Kauravas, that part was expanded and a dialogue was inserted. Right there, within it. And this dialogue, entirely in poetry, because the Mahabharata as a whole is a great poem. This is something very interesting for us to understand, that in these civilizations, poetry was sacred. This was inserted later on. And, from this little story, from this dialogue, they took the opportunity to insert a doctrinal foundation of everything that traditional Hinduism believed. So, the Bhagavad Gita. It is as if it were a miniature of all Indian doctrine, which is vast, and is practically accepted across all traditions. Today, it is important for us to understand this. India, as we know it today, does not have a single village of any significance that does not have its own unique way of practicing Hinduism. There are thousands of sects, with the most diverse philosophies you can imagine. From sects, materialist sects like the Carvakas, to those who focus on a single deity, and others who focus on another, there is a tremendous variety. We could say that this classic, the Bhagavad Gita, is one of the works that finds the most widespread acceptance in every corner. You know that India is home to many tendencies, many schools of thought. And the Bhagavad Gita is one of the works with the greatest universality within this context. So let's go ahead and get to know it a little better. Here we have a first image where you can see exactly the two protagonists of the story, Arjuna and Krishna. As I was saying, it's not possible for us to tell the whole story, which is a pity, because the story is beautiful, but it's enormous. Basically, the story of the Mahabharata is the story of the occupation of India. The way in which it arrived there in Aryabharta, ancient India, and fought against the peoples who lived there. You may have some idea about this. We even talked about it recently, that most of the things we consider history today were, for a long time, regarded as fantasy. Troy was once considered a fantasy, as was the Minoan-Mycenaean civilization. And then, at a certain point, an archaeologist or a researcher comes along and brings these things to light. There is something that has always been regarded as a fantasy, these accounts that, when the Indians arrived on the Indian subcontinent, there were already peoples living there. And there was a war, and in that war, they intermingled. Until, at a certain point, the civilizations of the Indus Valley were discovered. This remains a mystery to this day. Cities that are now located in Afghanistan, which are marvelous relics. Imagine cities the size of an ancient Egyptian city. Relics, grand and magnificent. We have them in the Indus Valley. These civilizations, the conflict they waged with primitive India, which is an Indo-European people, and the way they came to predominate in the land, the way they occupied the territory, is the story of the Mahabharata. Now you might ask, but is the book historical or symbolic? It is, both at the same time. It is interesting for us to understand what Helena Blavatsky said about this. She used to say that a work of this magnitude is usually, at the same time, historical, mythical, and mystical. This means it speaks of events that truly happened, of symbolic events that you must interpret and see through, and it also presents moral examples to be followed by humanity, which is the mystical aspect. So, you can never say this. It is only historical. It has multiple meanings. So, in the midst of this battle, in the midst of this entire story, at a certain moment, two families face off in a struggle for a city, the Pandavas and the Kauravas, who were cousins. They shared the same lineage and fought for the rule of a city. And when this war is set in motion, Arjuna, who was a Pandava prince, is led to the battlefield by a master, Krishna. And in the midst of the battlefield, he begins to ask a series of questions. Because, just imagine, two families, relatives to one another, fighting for control of a city. This stirs up a profound moral dilemma in Prince Arjuna, as he finds himself battling against his own kin, and he hesitates to fight. And it is precisely at this moment that Krishna, who was the charioteer of his carriage, reveals himself to Arjuna as a divinity. He explains why this battle is a sacred one. What is the meaning of this struggle? The battlefield where they fought, called Kurukshetra, Krishna turns to him and says, even the stars revolve more slowly to witness, at this very moment, the earth and the battle unfolding between the Pandavas and the Kauravas. Why is that? There, the destiny of humanity is being decided. Then he reveals that this was a war taking place within the human being, between their higher nature and their lower nature, between their virtues and their vices. In other words, it was the traditional battle between what a person truly is and what they are at that moment, between their flaws and the weaknesses of their personality. So, at the same time, it is a moral treatise because it is mystical, a religious text, a sacred book, a philosophical narrative, and it also contains much that is historical. It has a bit of everything. And you will see that it is the same when we look at the Odyssey. We recently spoke about it here. Everyone knows today that Troy existed in Anatolia, in Turkey. There is an archaeological mound there, but at the same time, Troy is speaking about the human being. You could find Achilles within yourself, you could find Odysseus within yourself, you could find within yourself Hector. So it is not just one thing or another, it is everything at the same time. And that is what is so impressive about these ancient stories. They can be analyzed from many different perspectives, and they are true from all of them. Nowadays, we almost never have the habit of analyzing things symbolically. This creates a boundary for us, a limitation. For example, it arrives in Europe in 1785, meaning that for the first time, it is taken out of the context of Hindi, of Sanskrit, and brought into a Western language. You will notice that many of the classics from the East, for instance, the Bardo Thodol, which is the Tibetan Book of the Dead, only arrived in the West in 1920. These are ancient books, predating the Christian era, but the West has only come to know them quite recently. And if I tell you that there are still things we might not know even today? Certainly, there are. Some very special books that perhaps we still do not know to this day. So, the idea of this book is to summarize the fundamental laws of the organization of the universe so that humanity can find its place. And it offers a synthesis of what life is, what you are doing within it, where you need to go, and with what tools. It tells you, I mentioned this to you before, there was a time when Egypt had what they called the Kybalion, the 7 spiritual laws, which are said to have come from Hermeticism, where, through 7 brief phrases, Hermes Trismegistus claimed to summarize the laws of the universe. Here, the Bhagavad Gita is a small book, a bit larger, but still a concise work. And the book's proposal is quite bold. It fundamentally aims to summarize how life works. Iona. What is an ordinary person? Where did he come from? Where is he going? And how can he get there? What is the destiny of humanity? In other words, it is a universal treatise on human nature, and this is conveyed from a master to a disciple. Now, it is interesting that we will have the opportunity to get to know these characters a little, briefly, within the time we have. This is a very classic scene. One of the most common things is to find images of this moment on the internet. It is the moment when Arjuna places himself at Krishna's feet and begins to ask questions and receive instruction, while the two armies face each other. It might seem a bit strange to our Western mindset that a disciple would be receiving a lesson in the middle of a battlefield, with both armies waiting calmly. But you will see that there is also a historical background to this. For these traditional peoples, war was ceremonial. There were a series of agreed-upon symbols, and until those rituals were completed, the war could not begin. So, in the middle of the battlefield, this conversation is the book itself. It's interesting that we have a film, which I have already mentioned to you before, called The Legend of Bagger Vance. Has anyone seen it? It is an adaptation made by a modern writer, Stephen Pressfield, of the Bhagavad Gita. Stephen Pressfield, who is a historian and writer of historical novels, constantly references the Bhagavad Gita and has a deep love for this book. He adapts the story to the 20th century, more or less. I don't know if any of you have ever had the opportunity to read about these. A golfer named Randolph Juneau. Randolph Juneau represents Arjuna. And Bagger Vance, who was his mentor, represents Krishna from the Bhagavad Gita. He creates an adaptation by taking the fundamental teachings and showing that they transcend both time and space. What does war mean in ancient traditions? Very briefly, always keeping in mind that we are summarizing, in a very short time, a book that contains profound and complex truths. War, as we understand it today, means destruction. In fact, even the concept of death in the West. We need to clarify this because in Eastern texts, when they speak of dying, they are not referring to annihilation. The Tibetan voice of the silence will come and say, kill the mind. It does not mean that you should be without a mind, but rather that you should subordinate it. The mind will continue to exist. Do you know why? They do not understand death as elimination or extinction. They see death as the overcoming of one stage in order to reach another, but they do not believe that anything truly ceases to exist. So, it becomes challenging when you try to transpose a concept from the East to the West. If I speak of war to us today, it means destruction, violence, a clash of interests. For them, war is friction. And friction is a necessity within the manifested universe. I wouldn't be here walking back and forth, speaking with you, if there were no friction between the sole of my shoe and the ground. I would remain motionless, standing still on the floor. If a being is to grow, to move forward, it must overcome friction. And friction means it will have to leave things behind to achieve new ones. Professor Jorge Angel Livraga, who founded New Acropolis, used to joke about this, saying there is no way for you to arrive at a new place if you don't first leave the one you're in, because there is a rather inconvenient law of physics that says a body cannot occupy two places in space at the same time. So, something will be left behind so something new can be born within you. And there is a struggle, a conflict between these two states. Everything that grows is leaving something behind. Not because it is bad, but because its time has simply passed. Do you understand this? The shoes you wore when you were 3 years old were not bad. They were simply what fit your feet at that time. It would be ridiculous for you to try to wear them today. Everything has its own moment. So, the process of substitution, which is universal, is part of all of nature. So, let us be careful not to harbor prejudice here. The goddess Athena represents this concept very well in Greece. Athena stands for intelligent warfare, for wisdom, in contrast to Mars, Ares, who represented that more wild and untamed form of war as we understand it today. Therefore, do not interpret the Bhagavad Gita as war in the modern, Western sense, but rather as war in the Eastern sense, one of overcoming, of growth. Everything came into the universe to grow and to evolve. We must leave things behind to make room for new things to be born. Well, continuing on. Some of the main characters we need to consider. Very basically, are the 5 essential elements of the Bhagavad Gita: the city of Ashanapura, which was the city they were fighting for, the 2 armies, the Kauravas and the Pandavas, who, as I mentioned to you, were cousins. The fathers of the young Kauravas and the young Pandavas were brothers. They were direct cousins, fighting for a city. Krishna, who is the master, represents within the Indian tradition a concept that is quite delicate and not very well understood in the West, which is the concept of the avatar. Have you ever heard of this word? Krishna is an avatar of Vishnu. The Indian tradition, like most religious traditions, works with the idea of a ternary Gauda triune, a triad or a trinity which is Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. The creator, the preserver, and the destroyer. Vishnu, who is the God that sustains the manifested universe, and who at this moment governs the maintenance of our universe, appears many times on earth in the form of various figures. You will see this in the Bhagavad Gita in a very beautiful way. Because Krishna, at a certain moment, says, "Whenever the world declines in righteousness, I come and I make myself a man among men to re-establish the same universal message of love." So, this Krishna is not an ordinary man. He is like a temporary manifestation of unity, of the whole. Here, he plays the role of divinity itself. It is divinity explaining itself to a man and revealing its purpose for life. So it is something extraordinary, because at a certain moment he says, "I created the sun." And Arjuna asks him, "But how? The sun has always been there, and you are no more than 30 or 40 years old." He replies, "You see only my current manifestation. I have never ceased to be. I have always existed. I created the sun, and I will create as many suns as may come into existence." In other words, he manifests as an episode in time and space, yet he is a being who exists beyond time and space. He is an avatar of Vishnu. So, these are the fundamental characters. All of them are within you. For you to understand the Bhagavad Gita, you would need to try to identify, within your own consciousness, a moment when you grew as a human being, and left behind an anger, an envy, a weakness. You will see that a part of yourself is left behind, a part to which you were deeply attached. And that hurts. But a new possibility is born, a new way of seeing the world, a new way of interacting with people, a new way of responding to life. And this ascent was usually inspired by some voice, the voice of principles, the voice of values that guided your consciousness on this journey, which is Arjuna. So you realize that all these characters exist within you. If you stop to think about it, and the Bhagavad Gita speaks about this, all the choices you have ever had, have, to make in your life, they seem like many, they seem like hundreds, they seem like thousands. But it says that this is an illusion. Deep down, you only have two choices, upward or downward, toward the spirit or toward matter. All the choices you have ever faced can be reduced to these two, either spirit or matter, either heaven or earth. And the path that ascends is when you choose the Pandavas. The path that descends is when you choose the Kauravas. And the consciousness that is trying to disidentify and rise upward is Arjuna. This consciousness is like an elevator, always searching for its place. And this voice that inspires you to seek the best within yourself, whether it comes through a person, a teacher, through the principles that this teacher has taught, or through an entire doctrinal aspect you encountered in a book that deeply moved your consciousness, this is the voice of Krishna. It is that which calls you upward, that which tells you, the time is now. You can no longer postpone your task of growth. To become a true human being, now. Have you realized that this is your own story? The Bhagavad Gita has no meaning if you do not find yourself within it. Chainapra, which is the city, is interesting if we observe it, because the city of elephants, there are a number of preconceptions we hold. We can't go too deep into this here, as we don't have much time, but regarding civilizations that include animals within their pantheons, we often lack a symbolic perspective. In India, the elephant was associated with wisdom due to its great strength and, at the same time, its remarkable delicacy in interacting with nature. It is said, though I am not sure if this is a myth or reality, that the elephant is capable of lifting its feet so as not to trample a line of ants passing by. In other words, strength is governed by a higher sensitivity, by a sense of spirituality. The elephant is a symbol of this. So, the city of Ashanapura, which was being contested, it represents a higher state of consciousness. That was in dispute. And so I have brought you a brief summary, which we would need to spend a good amount of time on to understand it better. But if you observe that triangle and that square at the end, for those who study philosophy with us, you are already familiar with this structure. It is a structure that, within Indian philosophy, is called the septenary constitution. The spirit is represented by a triangle. As we have mentioned, the concept of the Trinity is one of the most common elements found in all religions. And the quaternary below is considered matter, our personality, which would be the mind, emotions, energy, and the physical body. Human beings are said to be divided between these two worlds. But who is this human being? What are we, truly? Are we any of those vehicles? When we say that the human being is divided between these two worlds, who exactly is this human being? Is he not part of either of these two worlds? It is said that it is not. Have you ever stopped to ask yourself what you truly are? Who are you? If you experience physical pain right now, your awareness shifts to your physical body. If you feel tired, your awareness moves to your energetic aspect. If you become sad, it goes to your emotions. If you start to worry and think about something, it goes to your mind. What is it that moves? It is as if it were a focus, an eye that sees the world, traveling through all these vehicles, but it is not any of these vehicles. This is what we call human consciousness. What is evolving within us is our consciousness. If you stop to think about how many times, today, we have reflected on the meaning of our lives, on how committed we should be to humanity, this is the latest step our consciousness has taken. Altruism, fraternity, our consciousness, this little cell that rises and falls like an elevator through all these vehicles, is what we truly are, truly. As if it were a tiny cell of the body of God, traveling through the manifested universe. Choosing between the lower or the higher, identifying itself below or above. The very fact that we recognize we have two possibilities, essence and appearance, already means that we are a special being. Arjuna is a special being. He knows that he can choose between two worlds. Most people only know what is down here. They are not even aware that there is another possibility. He is the person who, at that moment, becomes aware of the contrast between two worlds and must make a choice. So ultimately, we are that higher step than our consciousness. We have dared to rise. And when all of this here is gone, what will remain? This cell, which traditions call the monad, this divine cell that has journeyed through all these planes, gathering consciousness along the way. Is that clear? So, basically, the human being would be the sum of the 3 and the 4. In India, they call this the septenary constitution, the sum of the 3, which always represents spirit, or the triad, and the quaternary, or, as the Greeks say, personality. Here, in the middle of the path, is Kurukshetra, where Arjuna stands. And here you have the two combatants. One side pulls upward, the other pulls downward. Basically, this is the battlefield of the human being. I showed you this very charismatic character, Darth Vader, who was clearly inspired, as I mentioned to you, by Joseph Campbell. In these ancient myths, the Kauravas represent the human personality, but not just the personality, rather, the personality addicted to domination. Because the personality itself is not evil. What is personality? The Greeks called personality persona, the mask we wear to come into the world. It is precisely our physical, energetic, emotional, and mental bodies. It is not bad, it is a tool. But being used to giving us orders, being used to dominating our lives. When it is in control, it becomes full of vices. That is when we'll see the birth of passions, impulses, and uncontrolled desires. Because if you believe that you are just this physical self, then the good things are those that benefit this physical self. But if you believe that you are humanity, then the good things are those that benefit humanity. Do you see how consciousness creates values according to its identity? So, it's not that the personality is inherently bad. At this point, it has simply undergone a process of, let's say, distortion. A loss of values, where it believes it is the only thing that exists. And it considers itself the center of the universe. So, the Kauravas are the defects, the vices we acquire that draw all our attention to our own personality. The greatest of these is selfishness. Believing that things only have value when they serve my own personal and private interests. These, then, are our friends, the Kauravas. Here is a little list. You can check off how many curable traits you recognize in yourself. Hypocrisy, pride, arrogance, presumption, anger, rudeness, ignorance, wrath, laziness, selfishness, vanity, prejudice, fear, sadness, and resentment. Phew, there is a lot that can be healed. These are all elements that shape our personality and make it feel like the center of the world. It is said that the worst of them, because they all emanate from it, is selfishness. All the other traits originate from it. And the Pandavas, as we have mentioned, represent the beneficial and positive forces that compel humanity to grow. That little voice that compels you to think and consider things from a broader perspective, that makes you feel pain for the suffering of humanity, that makes you feel the need for your life to serve something greater than merely surviving. That voice that sometimes keeps you from falling asleep because you feel that your day was not very humane. You could have done more, you could have gone further. These voices, if you compare them to the Kauravas, are small, they are quiet. You hear almost a whisper inside yourself. It is no coincidence that the Tibetan tradition is called the voice of silence. It is so gentle, it is as if it were a whisper, compared to the clamor made by the Kauravas. But this exists within us. None of us would be interested in philosophy if these voices did not exist within us. So, the battle is between these two worlds. Arjuna, as I mentioned to you, represents the conscious aspirant. The one who, at this moment, realizes that there are two worlds and that a choice must be made. There is a very beautiful phrase by Nietzsche that I like, in which he says that man is like a rope stretched over an abyss, between the animal and the Superman. A dangerous advance. Step by step, a dangerous. Trembling, hesitation and stopping a dangerous act, resuming the path. What does this mean? The animal and the Superman, the consciousness stretched between these two worlds, deciding whether it will turn back and settle into its instincts, into its selfishness, or whether it will move forward and find the fullness of its spiritual principles. And it is a constant hesitation, a constant fear, which is the fear of the unknown. It must be the greatest fear we have, you know? It is the fear of growing, because you don't know what's on the other side. What is behind you may be bad, but at least it is familiar. Don't you find it curious that sometimes a father or a mother who were not happy with the choices they made in life want to reproduce exactly that same way of life in their children, even though it didn't work out for them? Isn't that common? Do you know why? It's bad, but at least I know it. It's better than the unknown. Isn't that curious? The fear of growing and of the responsibility that comes with it, perhaps loneliness, perhaps having to rebuild your world on a new level, perhaps having to honor what you have achieved, is one of the greatest fears a human being can have. So, Arjuna is that human being who, at this moment, faces this contrast between two worlds and, therefore, possesses awareness, and he begins to make a choice. Don't just think of Arjuna, standing there between those two worlds, far away. We, too, constantly have to make choices. And we also have our own Bhagavad Gitas. Because what is to come finds its roots in the present. Some of you may remember, when I spoke about the life of Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, there is a beautiful passage from the Buddha's life that he shared, when he reached enlightenment, about his past incarnations. He had a very beautiful wife, a princess who, at a certain point, became his disciple. For those who know a bit of the story. And he said that, on one occasion, his disciples asked him, "Do you remember when you first met this princess?" He replied, "Look, I remember that in a past incarnation, I was a pearl fisherman and I married her. And we lived in great poverty. One day, I went away to search for a pearl that could rescue us from that misery. And when I returned with a marvelous pearl, worthy of a king, I found my wife on the verge of death. She was dying of hunger, because there had been a great famine in that region. So I went out in search of anyone who could exchange that pearl for a good plate of food to save my wife. And yes, I saved my wife. In a certain way, what I did now was just that. I traded the pearl of my life as a prince for the wisdom necessary to save her life. Do you understand this? In a certain way, I perfected what I had been doing life after life. I traded the pearl of a wealthy life, full of privileges, for a plate of spiritual nourishment. To save your life now, on another level. To save your soul from ignorance, from foolishness, from death. But what is done now has its roots in the past, because otherwise it could not be. You could not have a tree here if you did not have a little seed back there. Do you know what that means? That we will never become Arjuna, if the seed of Arjuna is not within us now. If we do not constantly have this conscious contrast, and do not know how to distinguish which choice lifts us up and which brings us down, the seed of Arjuna must be present here and now. Because if not, it will never be. It is interesting, this phrase taken from another sacred book, the Dhammapada, from the Buddhist tradition, which says, "Greater than the conquest in battle of 1,000 times 1,000 men is the conquest of oneself. More than defeating 1,000 men in battle. It is glorious and heroic to conquer oneself." You realize that this is not simply poetry, this is real. If I am fighting with you, I know where you are at all times, and that you are my enemy, and I know who I am. But now, if I'm fighting with something inside, do you realize I get confused with the enemy? Sometimes I think he and I are one and the same. Or I hand over the weapons so that he can destroy me. The inner war demands a level of identity and discernment that the external one usually does not require as much. You know at all times who you are on the battlefield and who the enemy is. No one gets confused in the middle of the battlefield about who they are and who the enemy is. The inner war requires a very deep level of discernment and identity, and it is much more difficult to win it than to win 1,000 external battles. It's a fact. Krishna, as I mentioned to you, is an appearance of Vishnu in the world. Here, a series of details come into play. Today, one of the main branches of Hinduism is the Vaishnava tradition, whose followers are disciples of Vishnu. According to Indian tradition, Vishnu is said to appear in the world 10 times. He has appeared 9 times so far. Krishna is considered to have been the 8th incarnation of Vishnu. There is a whole symbolism here that, unfortunately, we will not have time to explore. But it is said that when Krishna left the world, when he passed away, humanity entered a great materialistic cycle, which they call the Kali Yuga. The death of Krishna is believed to have occurred in 3102 years before Christ. This marks the beginning of the Kali Yuga, the Iron Age in which we live, the most materialistic era. You might say, but isn't this unfair? Was I really born in the most materialistic era? According to the Indian tradition, a person must learn to become a person of gold, regardless of whether the world is living through an age of iron. Because if you are simply a product of your environment, then the merit is not yours, it belongs to the environment. You should be able to be made of gold, even if the world is made of iron. And nature alternates between golden and iron ages precisely to forge humanity. Like a blacksmith forging a sword, plunging it into cold water and then into the fire, so that the sword becomes so well-tempered that neither water nor fire can break it. So, in truth, we could be born in any era, and according to this tradition, nothing would relieve us of the responsibility to build ourselves, regardless of our environment. It's interesting, and you see this a lot just drawing a parallel with our current historical moment, people who say, well, I went bankrupt. The business failed because the economic climate is bad. Even in these more limited areas of life, such as the economy, a person who is well prepared for circumstances can, at times of crisis, rise instead of fall. If you analyze it economically, there are companies that are thriving in the midst of the crisis, not necessarily because they are dishonest, but because they know how to navigate through a crisis. They foresee that the economy is unstable. They do not wait for the environment to be perfect in order to succeed. They are prepared to respond to circumstances, whatever they may be. Sometimes, out of a bit of envy, we say, that can't be honest. It can. A person can be prepared for circumstances. They can keep rising, even if circumstances decline. Even if circumstances aren't favorable, they can still be well. A human can be a product of themselves, not their environment. That is the story. So Krishna announces the start of a difficult era. But it is the duty of a person to be a person of gold, even if the age is one of iron. And then I speak a little about these inner words, which are very interesting because they represent the ultimate contrast. This is a very important idea, and it is also an Indian idea, the theory of contrast. When you have 2 colors, you are able to perceive both. If the entire universe were just one color, you would have no concept of colors. You perceive 2 sounds when you create contrast between them. If the universe had only one sound all the time, you would not recognize sound at all. Did you know that? Pythagoras said in the universe, one note sounds, music of the spheres. We don't hear it since it never stops. Without contrast, there is no awareness. If a person does not recognize in themselves the voice of Krishna, they do not generate this contrast. From the perspective of consciousness, they will not grow. If they do not seek what is most noble, most elevated, if they do not search for what is most human in themselves, and if they do not compare it with the rest, they will not create this contrast, which sparks the flame that is consciousness. He will not have the chance to grow. It is said that there is a possibility that a person may go through their entire life, completing their biological cycle and perfectly fulfilling what nature dictates, without their consciousness ever moving from its place. It is possible for a person to merely survive, but not truly live. Because if there is no advancement of consciousness, human life has not even begun. As the Greeks say, he has not even entered Chronos, he has not yet entered into time. From a human perspective, he is stationary at point zero. Therefore, a person can and should find the voice of Krishna within themselves each time they are willing to establish a contrast between two worlds, make a more conscious choice, and grow. And that is what it is all about. When all of this is over, what do you think will truly matter? After our final breath, after our entire life is left behind, the only thing that will truly matter is how much we have grown as conscious beings and how much we have allowed others to grow through our way of living. Nothing else will remain. It is the only thing that endures. Therefore, we are only truly alive when we work to make this happen, so that our lives, as human beings, may truly unfold. Well, now, speaking very briefly to you about the main doctrines found within the Bhagavad Gita. Of course, this is a complex subject to discuss in such a short amount of time. Dharma and karma, I believe, perhaps together with the septenary constitution which I showed you earlier, regarding our essence and our appearance, are among the most important laws for us to understand in life. I keep wondering how we can position ourselves in life without knowing how this game works. Where we are coming from, where we are going, and how we are going, what are the laws with which we interact, how to live, considering that life is a chaos or a game whose rules no one has told you. I remember when I was about 14 or 15 years old, and on one occasion I was talking with a classmate and I said the following: I have the impression that I sat down at a card table and was dealt several cards. And the game is going on and I'm just drawing cards onto the table, but no one tells me what the rules of the game are. Who wins? And what do they win? Who loses? And what do they lose? And where are we trying to go with all of this? That is exactly the feeling we have. No one ever explained to us what the foundation of the game is, what the meaning of all this is. For me, one of the most useful and most complex teachings found in the doctrines of all philosophies of the past is precisely Dharma and Karma. Dharma is described, as they say in India, as the arm of God extended over the cosmos. It is a law that calls all beings toward unity. In other words, all beings have come into the world in order to grow once again toward unity, becoming ever more conscious. That is, the entire universe is called to return to the Father's house, as the Jewish tradition says. In other words, to evolve toward ever more noble states of consciousness. And this path, this road that leads toward unity, is the path of Dharma. Now, evidently, every being, when beginning to learn something, is subject to making mistakes. We have just arrived in the world, we do not fully understand the laws of the world, and we will stray from this law of Dharma. And this deviation, which is natural and expected in the beginning, every time you stray from Dharma, there will be a painful reaction. That tends to make you aware that you have strayed, so you can return. So, you will experience the dance of Dharma and Karma, which is this process here. A law that leads you back to the one, and a variation around it. Each time you deviate, there comes a pain that pushes you back. Do you realize that this is similar to Newton's laws, only on the metaphysical plane? Every action generates a reaction of equal intensity in the opposite direction. It's the same idea. It makes a lot of sense, both in the physical and in the metaphysical realms. And this law of nature, whose cause provokes reactions that bring you back cause and effect, is the law of karma, which does not exist to punish or chastise you, but to help you find your way. Why do you think your tooth hurts when there's a problem with it? Is it because nature conspires against you and wants to make you suffer? No, it's because nature wants you to save your tooth. Because if it didn't hurt, it would fall out without you ever realizing there was a problem. Pain is a vehicle for awareness. Now this would be the expected path. Think of a child learning to walk. When they take their first step, you expect them to fall. They take a second step and still expect them to fall. By the 10th or 20th step, you expect them to stand a little longer. By the 30th or 50th step, a little longer still. In other words, you expect them to learn from their mistakes, until one day they find their balance. Now, when a person does not recognize the laws of the universe, what happens to the human journey? When they do not learn from life, what becomes of them? They stray from the law and begin to suffer. They blame others. They blame their father, mother, boss, neighbor. Look at how much I suffer. I'm a victim. How is anyone going to feel sorry for me? And when will this change? We have to change the government, politics, religion. I have to change my marriage, my mother-in-law, my boss. Everyone is against me. Isn't that right? And they do not learn from pain. Or do they? Do you think everyone you know who suffers is actually growing? We have a marvelous invention, placing the blame for everything on someone else. This solves things briefly, but it brings a serious problem. It is the other person who grows, because they are the one with the problem, not you. No one takes responsibility for anything. A person who does not take responsibility for anything we could call irresponsible, and the irresponsible do not grow. So, nature expected this from us, that we would learn from pain by taking responsibility for it, and by seeing pain as something symbolic, and that this would help us trace our own past. But when we do the opposite, when we victimize ourselves and shift the blame, pain only causes us to remain stuck in the same place. We end up searching for someone to blame in every corner of the world. Today, we live according to the theory of irresponsibility. Everyone else is to blame for your problems except you. And more, we become fixated on the same point. Suffering does not move us even a millimeter forward. This is not a problem of nature, but of human learning. We have not truly understood how the laws of nature work. Iona, karma, as mentioned, is not a punishment. It is not striking you so you suffer. It is striking you so you may learn through pain, once again find your path. There are morbid pains and there are pedagogical pains. This is a morbid pain, that is a pedagogical pain. Do you understand? There are positive pains and negative pains, as with all in the universe. The immortality of the soul. This is a very beautiful passage in this work, because Arjuna is there, weeping over having to fight against his own relatives. And there comes a moment when Krishna turns to him and says, in fact, son of Kunti. It is interesting, because there are passages in this book where you can see how all these religious traditions are related at their roots. And isn't it curious to come across an Indian book? And suddenly, Krishna comes and says, truly, I tell you, O son of Kunti. This appears there several times. There never was, nor will there ever be a time when I, you, or any of these princes of the earth have ceased or will cease to exist. That which is eternal. Therefore, do not think that you can kill something real, that it is possible to destroy what is real. Everything is illusion. You are simply going to fulfill your dharma, which commands you not to remain here any longer. To be is to move forward, but both states are eternal. There is nothing that truly dies or something that truly is born. All that is eternal. This is the notion of reality for the ancient Indian tradition. It is eternity. That which is eternal. So, for this tradition, the idea of the immortality of the soul is part of a logic of understanding the universe. Things cannot cease to be, because if they cease to be, it is because they never truly were. They are only shadows. They are only illusions. Human nature is part of a real world where things never cease to exist. And what we experience is a play of illusions, but there is indeed a lesson to be learned through it. It's as if I were playing war with you. I'm at war against you, Stephanie, but it's just a game. If you want to beat me, you need to know the rules, right? Ever played war? Did you play with that when you were teenagers? I loved it. I'm at war against her, but the game has rules. Even though it is just play, an illusion, it has rules. And if you don't follow these rules, you won't be able to defeat me. And these rules will require from you sharpness, attention, and concentration. By obeying these rules, you will acquire virtues. The game is not real, but your virtues are. If you learn from it, you will come out greater than when you entered. Do you understand? And that is reality. When you press the game button and the screen disappears, what remains? What remains is all the skill you developed while playing it. Because that is real. Is life more real than a game screen? It's basically the same thing. Eventually, someone will press a button and all of this will disappear. And then another scene, very similar, will appear. And only what you have developed previously will remain. Detachment is a very interesting concept. Krishna tells Arjuna that the only way to overcome this world of illusions is through detachment. Because if everything is illusory, what will you desire? If everything is dust, will you desire dust? You need to transfer your desires to a realm where you can attain something real. The Buddhist tradition speaks about this in a very beautiful way, which is detachment. If you seek detachment, the Noble Eightfold Path, which is right intention, right livelihood, right concentration, what are you truly seeking? Not the fruit, not the outcome of your actions, but that the way you act is truly human. And I find fulfillment not because I achieved or failed to achieve some external result, but because the way I acted was humane. It does not matter whether I gained the world, gained nothing, or lost everything. What matters is that anyone who examines my path will see that a human being walked here. I responded to circumstances as a human being. Now, results are illusory. Winning or losing is something very circumstantial, sometimes of very little practical value. In fact, who wins or loses anything in the world? I was joking with you other day saying I keep imagining a man who puts a fence around a piece of land and says, "This land is mine." The earth must be dying of laughter at us, right? How many billions of years has this land been here? A soul living 70 or 80 years thinks he owns it. Isn't that a joke? It is. A joke. In truth, what can we actually gain in this relationship with the earth? The fact that we behave as human beings and it as the earth? Each one doing what corresponds to them, the earth will germinate. They'll generate values, virtues, wisdom. What will remain from my relationship with it? Each has fulfilled their role in this drama of existence. But to possess one, to possess the other, that is foolishness. Who possesses what? It is all a great illusion, and the only thing that will remain from all of this is the way we deal with things, because that is real. When the switch of the game is turned off, all that remains is the virtue you developed through how you handle the elements of the game. If you learned righteousness, the game was worthwhile. Righteousness is real, even though the game was nothing but a mere illusion. It vanished the moment you pressed the button. The play button takes everything away, but it cannot take the virtues you have developed. Therefore, right action is that which seeks the manner in which you act, not the fruits of the action. It is said that one day this will be so complete that a person will expect absolutely nothing except to act as a human being. The day that a human being can attain this total purity, this complete absence of desires, wisdom will have been reached. This is the essence of the Bhagavad Gita, which teaches that it frees a person from the illusory world, from pain, from the world of suffering. I won't go into too much detail, because this material was prepared for a longer session than the time we have today. But Krishna, among many other things, speaks about the different ways of moving through the world. That a person must be in motion, even if you are sitting still in a chair. Within you, your feelings and your thoughts are in motion, and this generates karma. This influences other people, even if you do not utter a word. Your feelings and your thoughts add to or subtract from those of humanity. Did you know that? You are alive, generating influence. There is no inaction. You are in the world, you are taking action. Inaction is to die. It is the only way. I was even telling you about a doctor who has a theory that people die. On average, 2 or 3 years after retirement, a high incidence of people pass away. And he conducted a study to try to find out why this happens in the United States. And he developed a theory that is controversial. I don't know if it's true, in which he said, people spend their whole lives telling themselves, they'll stop working and do nothing. I'm going to put my feet up and do nothing. And he says, a person programs their mind, and the body carries it out. When you say it'll do nothing, what will your body get? It will die, because if you're alive, you'll do something, right? In other words, the possibility of inaction does not exist. He goes on to talk about the 3 types of action. Either you find the perfect action, which is the right action, what he calls sattva, which is the one that seeks nothing more than your own fulfillment as a human being. Or you go to excess out of anger, out of impulse, or you become overwhelmed by action through inertia. When you go to excess because of anger or impulse, this is called rajas. When you fall short due to inertia, that little word we find so charming, laziness. This is tamas. So, it is as if there is a triangle of possibilities for action in the world. On one side, there is excess, anger, and impulse. On the other side, inertia. And at the top, sattva, which is balanced action, restraint. Does this triangle remind you of anything? Any other symbolism? A triangle is reminiscent of a little manger, where on one side you have an ox or a bull, and on the other, a donkey. The ox, the bull, is always associated with impulse, anger, and instinct. And the donkey? Inertia, the one who holds back, the one who refuses to move. And at the top of the manger, who was there? The Christ, who represents balance. When you set this up in your living room at Christmas, did you know that you are expressing a universal myth that goes back many millennia, more than you can imagine? A plan of action down below, either through inertia or through excess. And balance, inspired by something nobler and higher that resides within human beings, not outside of them. Right action. Just for you, every time you see a nativity scene from now on, remember the Bhagavad Gita. I won't go into too much detail about this here, but I mentioned it to you. That, according to Indian tradition, which can sometimes be difficult for Westerners to grasp, all these beings who came to humanity to bring messages, to remind human beings of who they are, of what they are, and where they must arrive with all of this, were messengers of a single idea. Messengers of unity. Wherever they were, at any crossroads in space and time in which they lived, adapting their language to that context, they were speaking of a single thing, of how humanity can return home. That is why Krishna says, whenever the world declines in virtue and justice, I come, the Master, and make myself human among humans. Always. So, all these beings would be conveying a single message, a single idea. And sometimes this seems complex to people, because we tend to think that only one brought this idea. Do you realize that, in doing so, we are projecting our own selfishness outward? It cannot be the wise master who enlightened the East millennia ago. It has to be only this one. It cannot be another. In a certain way, by wanting to limit the possibility of transmitting wisdom, we are projecting our own selfishness outward. This Indian tradition of the avatars says that there is a commitment from the divine to always be among human beings whenever humanity is in need. Helena Blavatsky uses a concept that she calls it dynamic eternity, and it is very beautiful. She said that if you look at all those stars in the sky, they are countless suns, and that in every direction there must be countless planets, and perhaps innumerable beings at the same level as us or even more advanced, and that in every direction there must be masters calling out to these beings in some direction. She cannot imagine what languages these masters speak, nor what words they use, but what do they say? She knows. They call all the children back home, all of nature back to unity. Do you understand? I cannot even imagine what they are like, nor what language they speak, but what they say, I know. They are calling the children back home. And she is not speaking from here. She is speaking from the four corners of the universe moving toward the one. Every human being is, to some extent, an Arjuna, a warrior who strives to be better, who seeks to conquer their virtues. Basically, this is a brief summary. As I mentioned to you, this is not a work that we can explore in great detail in such a short time. But this is just so you can have an idea of its greatness, its universality, and how much it has to teach us. It is rare for me to meet someone who reads the Bhagavad Gita with attention and care, and does not place this book among their bedside books. Because it truly is worth it. I keep thinking about how many beautiful things we sometimes put at the end of the line, behind certain immediate needs of ours. How many trivial and meaningless things we read without ever having read a book like this. If we had a society that perhaps truly cared more about the education of the human being, in the sense of drawing out and bringing forth what is best within each person, maybe we would create a more thoughtful list of our required readings. And this is a book that should never be left out. It is not just Indian, it is universal, regardless of religious beliefs. It is also a treatise on philosophy, addressing how to achieve our true human condition. And where do we want to go with all of this? And what tools should we use? Well, this is what I have to share with you. As I mentioned, time is very short, so we have condensed everything into a few simple ideas, which I hope will be useful. I know some of you have come into contact with this work, and for those who haven't had the chance, I invite you not to miss the opportunity because it is truly worthwhile. It is a treasure of humanity. What's it after all?